Joining me now from Winnipeg is James Bezan, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. We are going to get to Toronto in just a moment for the NDP's parliamentary reform critic, Craig Scott. But here first, in Vancouver, Joyce Murray, the Liberal defence critic. And as soon as Craig Scott is all wired up, we'll bring him in as well. Thanks to everybody for being here. I appreciate your time. James Bezan, let's start with you if we can. Is the government considering expanding the mission against ISIS to include striking targets within Syria?
Well, we haven't made any decisions yet, Rosie, but we are looking at all our options. We are quite satisfied that the coalition, including the Canadian Armed Forces, have made significant progress against ISIL, that the fight on the ground led by the Iraq security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga are having success. So we are looking at if we do plan on going ahead, how we go ahead. And once Cabinet makes that decision, there will be a motion that will be brought before the House if the decision is to extend the mission. Okay,
a couple of things I want to break down there before I move on to the other parties. Would the mission be longer than 6 months, the extension? Would you consider making it longer so that you don't have to go back potentially during an election, right before an election, so extending it to perhaps a year?
Look, no decisions have been made. Once that decision's made, all parliamentarians and all Canadians will be informed if there is a decision to extend. But at that point in time, until then, I can't speculate on what those decisions are going to be.
But fair to say that would be an option, that you would...
All options are on the table, of course.
Okay, let me bring in everybody else and also remind people of what the Defence Minister Jason Kenney told guest host Terry Molesky on CBC Radio's The House this weekend. He was asked some questions on a teleconference earlier today and repeated it, but I'll play this clip just so people get a sense of where Mr. Kenney's thinking is at. Take a listen.
The motion that we tabled at the House in the fall and that was adopted by the House of Commons does not exclude the possibility of supporting Allied operations in Syria if the conditions are correct, and that is something that we'll have to make a final decision on. We do note with interest that ISIL is moving much of their armored equipment back into Syria. They appear to be consolidating in and around their Ersatz capital of Raqqa in east central Syria, and we're watching that with great interest.
So it's fair to say you're not ruling it out?
That's fair to say.
Okay, let's go to Craig Scott now, who's all wired up in Toronto. Good to see you, Mr. Scott. Appreciate you being here, too. What do you make of that? That if ISIS is retreating, as that is the goal, right, to push them back out of Iraq, and ultimately what the coalition's goal is to destroy ISIS, I suppose. But if they're moving into Syria, why shouldn't the Canadian mission also move the air mission and expand it to hit targets into Syria?
Oh, there's a couple of points to make. First of all, it's not as if they're moving back into Syria. That's where the huge concentration of ISIS forces already is. And so the idea that you're somehow chasing ISIS back into Syria is already the wrong image. The second thing is the British House of Commons specifically excluded Syria with respect to authorizing UK action in Iraq. Ours didn't. So what Mr. Kenney seems to be saying is that, yes, we may want to extend in time our mission, but he seems to be saying that our motion in the House of Commons, the ones passed by virtue of the vote of the Conservative Party, is already sufficient to be dealing with Syria, whatever other legalities might have to be taken into account. He specifically said Syria is not excluded from the current resolution, and that's deeply worrying.
Why? Why is that particularly worrying?
It's deeply worrying because this government, and frankly any Western Allied intervention, do not understand the dynamics on the ground, do not know exactly what the impact will be of having deeper and deeper Western involvement. Whether it's Libya, whether it's all kinds of decisions that were made in Afghanistan, whether it's the U.S. in Iraq from 2003 onwards, the complete lack of understanding of the complexity and what intervention from Western forces will do that will be counterproductive and actually produce blowback is one of the lasting stories over the last almost 15 years. And so the idea that he would blithely say Syria is just, across the border and therefore let's consider going in there is a suggestion that, to me, suggests that this government really has drawn no lessons from the kinds of blowback, counterproductive effects of Western intervention in the past.
Okay, Joyce Murray, your take on this potential that the defense minister is at least considering, and the reality that, okay, I take Mr. Scott's point that yes, ISIS has always been within Syria, but I think the point Mr. Kenney's making is that they're being pushed out of Iraq, so maybe there's less to do in Iraq. Joyce Murray?
Well, Rosemary, the threat of ISIL is a real and serious threat to international security, and that's why the Liberals support the idea of Canada being part of an international coalition against ISIL.
Even if that includes bombing in Syria?
Well, so let me get there. The concern that we have is this Prime Minister has not been open and transparent about the operations to date, claimed that we would not be doing accompanying of frontline troops. That turned out not to be the case, sadly. So they're not to be trusted on this. The Prime Minister did say that Canada would not be involved in Syria unless requested by the Syrian president. So at this point, we can't speculate on the motion, what the motion will be, but we have serious concerns about the credibility of this government that has not been open and honest about what's going on.
So, Mr. Bezan, then that is a fair point that Mr. Harper has said that you would need permission or to discuss it with Bashar al-Assad. I have no idea how that conversation would take place. What would be the conditions around that for Canada?
Well, let me go back to what Joyce just said. Our government has been completely transparent, holding technical briefings on an ongoing basis as to the operations of Canadian Armed Forces in Operation Impact throughout Iraq. We've been out there informing how we've been making out with our bombing campaign, with our Air Task Force, and the great work done by the Royal Canadian Air Force. So I think that she's been very unfair in that characterization. You know, we have a debate in the House of Commons on this motion that's currently enabled us to do this mission. That's something that never happened under a previous Liberal government. So we have this chance for an opportunity for parliamentarians to fully discuss the upcoming mission and the current mission. And so as we look forward, and as Minister Kenney said, yes, there is definitely a recalibration on behalf of ISIL. ISIL is a threat, and as we've been calling it, it is a genocidal death cult. So let's make sure that we degrade them as best as possible, and if that means that they concentrate all their efforts into Syria, then we have to take a serious look at that. But
you acknowledge the complications or the complexity of having to have a conversation with al-Assad.
It's hugely difficult. We don't, at any way, shape, or form, approve of the Assad regime. You know, there is a civil war that's been going on there for 4 years now, and hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced and murdered. So, you know, we aren't at all interested in empowering him in any way possible. So we'll be working with coalition partners as we look at whether or not there is a role for Canada to play in Syria. But the bigger issue right now is making sure that ISIL, which has declared war on Canada as well, is degraded as best as possible by our brave men and women.
So I'll just get your opponents to weigh in there, Craig Scott. How does that work then? How do you go into Syria without somehow aiding Assad? How do you make that work?
Well, at some level you can't, and I think James wouldn't probably disagree with that at a certain point a decision would have to be made that the fight against ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call them, is the priority, even if it means actually diverting forces away from the fight against Assad, as in by moderates in Syria. So it could well strengthen them. And that's part of the calculations that I just don't think that NATO and Western powers really are going to likely get right. They have to figure out exactly what it is they think they're going to achieve and explain it to people. My big concern, though, is what Mr. Kenney was saying, was that he was reminding people that the current resolution allows Canada to go into Syria if, as an executive decision, the government of Canada, through discussions or some kind of invitation from Assad, decides to go into Syria. He's not saying that we need, in the next 3 weeks, for example, that we actually need a new resolution in the House. That's really crucial, so that if we also get a new resolution extending the mission, the idea that we could go into Syria is actually already part of the way they framed it.
Okay.
They've already framed it that way.
Okay, and I'll get James Bezan to respond to that. Go ahead, Joyce Murray.
Well, another aspect of this, Rosemary, I want to raise is that while we haven't seen this motion yet, and the minister is floating a whole lot of stuff out in comments here and there, the reality is we're quite concerned about the Canadian Armed Forces' capability to do more because of the massive budget cuts that have taken place under this Conservative government, starting in 2010. And we know that an average of 23% of funding that was approved by Parliament for the National Defence budget was clawed back over the years. 23%, when typically it might be 2 or 3%, was surplus to the year's needs. So there's been a huge shrinkage of capacity. And can the Canadian Forces safely actually do more, given that challenge they face?
Okay, James Bezan, you can respond to that. And I have one last question before I let you go.
Okay, and Joyce, that's just completely ridiculous. You know that at the height of the Afghanistan war, that we're spending just under $23 billion a year. This year, we're spending just over $20 billion. We are flying our sorties with new upgraded CF-18 fighter jets that can do all sorts of amazing stuff and really use these precision-guided missiles. We're also flying over there with new C-17 Hercs and heavy-less capabilities. So all the equipment is there that our special operation forces and the Royal Canadian Air Force need. So they're doing great work, and we're proud of the work that they're doing.
Mr. Bezan, let me just ask specifically before I let you go, is there anything to what Mr. Scott is suggesting there, that you don't need to rewrite the motion because it already allows for the troops to go into Syria? It would just be renewing the motion. Would that be true?
That's one of the options that are out there, and of course in the current motion that the House approved, it does talk about having proper authorization from Syria to do any attacks against ISIL in Syria. So that is a possibility, but we're going to look at all our options, and then once we have a decision by government, we'll bring that motion before our House for full debate. And
just to be clear, because CP is reporting now that it could be a year-long expansion, which frankly might make sense, because if we end up in an election in October, this might not be the thing that everyone wants to be discussing. I don't know.
And if you look at historically, when we approved the motion in the House to deploy troops to Afghanistan, we went with longer terms than just 6 months when our troops were on the ground fighting the Taliban.
Okay, I'll just let you both wrap up, Craig Scott and Joyce Murray. Would you be comfortable with that, a one-year extension of the mission, if that's the direction the government goes? I'm guessing no, Greg Scott, but
no,
go ahead.
I mean, absolutely not. Partly because you have to have a much clearer, transparent framework for what would be the extended mission, and that we already feel like there's been a combination of mission creep and a failure to be straight with Canadians about what the current mission even is. No, I mean, it would have to be a very different set of conditions that we would have to debate anew.
Joyce Murray, and then I'm going to wrap up.
We won't speculate. We want to see the motion first, but the trust issue is paramount. And we recently had the minister and the parliamentary secretary saying that the Canadian forces in Northern Europe have been being engaged and buzzed by planes and boats, and NATO saying, flatly denying that actually happened. So I think we have a real credibility and trust problem on the part of this government. And so whatever they bring forward, they're going to have to battle the fact that the Canadians aren't able to trust what they're proposing.
Okay, I got to wrap it up. I had like 5 other questions for you, but I got to leave it there. We'll have you back. Thank you all for your time when you're on your busy constituency weeks. Appreciate it. James Bezan, Craig Scott, and Joyce Murray. Thank you all.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thanks, Rosie.